What's going on, guys? Kevin here from thesportsgeek.com, and in this video, I'm going to go over my best and worst lineup from the NFL Week 3 Millionaire Maker Tournament at DraftKings. And I didn't have a great week or anything, but I think it's a good idea to go over your lineups and figure out what you did right, figure out what you did wrong, and what you can take forward going into future weeks. So if you guys do enjoy these videos, make sure you click that like or thumbs up button on YouTube. If I get enough support, I'll try to do them weekly. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the second YouTube channel here. This is my second channel. This is where I'll be doing these types of more casual videos. All right, so first off, we're going to take a look at my best lineup of the week. As you can see, it was only 197 points, so not a great week for me. The winner of this tournament had, I think, 247 points. So it wasn't a great week, and a lot of that was because of my quarterbacks on the week. My favorite quarterbacks were Mariota, Rivers, Carr, and Luck, which were 4 quarterbacks from 2 different games. And then I had a lot of Ben Roethlisberger stacks. So my top 5 quarterbacks did pretty brutal. Not necessarily performance-wise for some of them, but for fantasy scoring, they did pretty brutal. So I didn't have a great week at all. And then I had a couple other lineups with some other quarterbacks that you'll see in this video. So this lineup here that finished with 197 points had Tannehill stacked with Landry and Parker. So Landry had a big game. He was in my video. He put up 29 points. Parker put up 14 DraftKings points, so he got an early touchdown, but then kind of disappointed after that. Tannehill ended up finishing with just under 25 DraftKings points. Kristen Michael was the 3rd ranked running back in my Fantasy Labs model, so I had him quite a bit. He put up 28 DraftKings points, which was pretty good for his $5,000 price tag. Demarco Murray was 6,300. He put up 29 DraftKings points. I would have had more of him, but I had so many pass catchers from the Tennessee-Oakland game. I had a lot of the receivers there. Had a lot of Delaney Walker for Tennessee, but had to swap him out, obviously. But didn't have as much Murray as I would have liked just because I had so many receivers in that game. Marvin Jones Jr., I had quite a bit of, I think around 15 to 17% of. He was only 10% owned. So I got a pretty good edge there. Unfortunately, I had him in a lot of lineups that had like Mariota or one of the bad quarterbacks that I picked this week. He put up 41 DraftKings points. Dennis Pitta was 21.9% owned. He only put up 10 DraftKings points. So I think with tight ends and defenses, you got to be careful. If they're going to be high owned, they're pretty random positions. Tight ends and defenses are really tough to predict fantasy output. So I think those are 2 positions that you want to try to avoid the chalk. So the Dolphins were 33% owned here. This week, they only put up 7 DraftKings points. Pitta was almost 22% owned. He only put up 10 DraftKings points. So if you can predict who's going to be really high owned at tight end and defense, I would try to fade those players for the most part. You don't have to fade them completely. But if you think the Dolphins are going to be 33% owned, if you have them in maybe 15% of your lineups, that way you're still giving yourself a shot if the Dolphins go off for a huge defensive game. But then if they have a bad game, you're giving yourself a bit of an edge. So with positions like that where it's tough to predict points, I think going against the popular plays is a pretty good option, at least being under owned compared to the field. So if Pitta, if you expect him to be 20% owned, but you still like him for that week, maybe you throw him in 15 or less, maybe 10 to 15% of your lineups. For positions like quarterback or receivers where you can predict their output a little better, you don't have to fade the chalk if you really like the chalk. But I think tight end and defense is 2 positions where I'm going to try to employ that strategy a little more. I kind of did it this week. I faded Pitta. I was going to have him in maybe 20 to 25% of my lineups, but after hearing everyone else talk about him, I kind of faded him a little bit. I had him in about 10% of my lineups, I think. And same with Dolphins defense. Obviously, everyone thought they were a good play. They were a pretty good play, but if you know the field's going to be 33%, then obviously you want to try to get a little bit under that. So I think I went about 15 to 20% with the Dolphins. So that was the only good takeaway from week 3 for me. And then this lineup also had Dez Bryant. He was the only, this was the only lineup with Dez Bryant in it. I had maybe 2 or 3 with Alshon Jeffrey, and I ended up swapping out to Dez Bryant here for a little more upside, just with Alshon Jeffrey being injured. Thought Dez Bryant had a better opportunity to put up a high score, so I swapped him in instead when I saw this lineup was doing okay after the afternoon games. He put up 13 points with that touchdown, and this lineup was okay with 197 points, but overall disappointing week with this being my top lineup. All right, so now my worst lineup of the week, 73 points. It was with Carson Palmer, which I didn't have too many lineups with Palmer in. I think I tweeted out Sunday morning that I liked Palmer. Just liked too many quarterbacks to throw him in a lot of lineups. Same thing happened with Aaron Rodgers. I liked him, but couldn't get him in enough lineups just because there's other quarterbacks that I liked more. So for Rodgers, it was disappointing that I couldn't get him in more lineups, but for Palmer, it actually worked out well. I couldn't get him in too many lineups. You can see here, he only put up 7 DraftKings points. I double stacked him with John Brown and Michael Floyd. So this was more of an ownership play. I figured that the Cardinals were in a pretty good spot going against the Bills as 4-point favorites with a total around 48 points. Pretty high implied team total. And the projected ownership on Fantasy Labs was pretty low for Palmer. And I figured that John Brown would be really low, and he's got high upside for a GPP. Michael Floyd, I figured, would be a bit higher than 2.3%. I thought he'd be closer to 10% owned, but I still thought he'd be quite a bit lower than Larry Fitzgerald. So I thought this would be a pretty good low-owned stack if it went off. And unfortunately for me, it was a huge bust with Palmer throwing for 4 interceptions. Kenyon Drake was a guy who I threw in a couple lineups on Sunday morning. Not a great play, maybe looking back at it, but for GPPs, I'll usually do this if I'm throwing in multiple lineups. If I think there's a guy who's like cheap like this, 3,600, who has some upside, he was named the starter on Sunday morning, so I thought he did have some upside to maybe score 20 DraftKings points, and I thought he would be low owned. I'd usually throw someone like that in maybe a couple lineups if I'm doing a lot of lineups for a certain contest. So I threw him in a couple, didn't work out, 6.8 points. Deangelo Williams was a guy I loved. He only put up 8 points, mostly because of Pittsburgh's defense. So they gave up a ton of points early. They couldn't run the ball in the second half at all. They had to throw quite a bit, and obviously didn't do much with that either, only putting up 3 points for the day. So pretty brutal all around. All of my Pittsburgh plays were pretty brutal. I had a lot of Roethlisberger to Brown with Deangelo Williams. Brown had a good game, but obviously Roethlisberger had a pretty brutal game. So that didn't work out. Jeremy Maclin was a play I'm not too disappointed in for myself for making it. $6,000 for him. He's coming off a game where he got 15 targets. He did get 7 targets in this game, and this is a game where they were leading pretty big for most of the game. So he did get his 7 targets, only turned that into 7.5 DraftKings points. That was disappointing, but I don't hate the play at $6,000 for a guy who's usually going to get a lot of targets. Dwayne Allen was kind of a bit of a flyer pick. It was tough to decide between Dwayne Allen and Doyle, both the tight ends from the Colts. I thought that one of them might have a big game, so I kind of had them both spread out in some lineups. Neither of them ended up having a huge game. Doyle had some big catches. Dwayne Allen ended up dropping a pass in the end zone, so he could have maybe put up somewhere around 13 or 14 DraftKings points if he held in that pass. But he disappointed with 6.5 points. That game overall was just lower scoring than I expected. I expected it to get over the total of 51. It finished with 48 points. So it was decently high scoring, but some of the guys that had in that game didn't do too well. Jordan Matthews, again, I thought Pittsburgh and Philly would be in a high scoring game. I thought Pittsburgh might score quite a few points, and then Philly might have to throw the ball quite a bit in the second half. So I liked Matthews quite a bit at 7,100. He got that early touchdown, but then they got ahead big and they didn't really need to throw too much. So he only put up 9.9 points. And then Seahawks defense, I usually don't pay up for defenses too often, but I did have, ended up having quite a few lineups with Seahawks. Just the way my lineup building went, I had a lot of Mariota sharp stacks with like a cheaper tight end. So I had a lot of money left over. Ended up going with too many Seahawks shares, but I wasn't too upset with the play looking back at it, just because their ownership was 7.4%. Usually an elite defense like the Seahawks at home, big favorites, pretty low total. Usually they would be around 15 to 20% owned, but I figured that the Seahawks wouldn't be that high this week just because a lot of people would be on the Dolphins. So that's kind of why I went to the Seahawks, and I didn't mind the play. Obviously, it didn't work out for me, only 3 DraftKings points, but I think if it went the other way, if they put up 30 DraftKings points, I would have been pretty happy with it. So I'm not too disappointed in that play. Overall, just a brutal lineup. I had a lot of pretty bad lineups just because my quarterbacks and my quarterback wide receiver stacks didn't go off at all this week. So overall, disappointing week 3 for me, but I think it's part of the process to look at your lineups, kind of review them, see what you did right, see what you did wrong, and see what notes you can take forward with you. So if you guys enjoyed this lineup review video, if you guys want to see my best and worst lineup each week, make sure you hit that thumbs up button. And if I get enough support, I'll continue to do them. I hope you guys had a decent week. And if not, hope you have a good week here in week 4.